For years, the black gardener toiled in silence, unnoticed and unappreciated, his worth dismissed by those around him. While the rich man reveled in his wealth, he saw the gardener as nothing more than a tool, a servant beneath him, whose life held no value. Little did he know, the humble gardener harbored a secret, a truth so powerful it would shatter everything the rich man thought he knew. Would the gardener's quiet resilience finally be his revenge? The story begins on an unusually hot afternoon in a sprawling estate, hidden behind thick gates and elaborate hedges that shield its grandeur from the world beyond. The camera zooms in on the mansion's well-kept facade, where life seems perfect, but there's an unsettling tension in the air. The estate is owned by Edmund Rivers, a wealthy, self-assured man in his mid-50s. Edmund's life is about control of his environment, his image, and most importantly, the people around him. He takes pride in his reputation as a self-made millionaire and enjoys boasting about it. But as the camera shifts, we see him dismissing his gardener, Miles Williams, with a laugh. Miles, a tall black man in his 30s, is trimming the hedges near the mansion's side entrance. His appearance contrasts sharply with Edmund's pristine lifestyle: simple clothes, sweat on his brow, a calm and quiet demeanor. The two men seem to have a familiar rapport, but it's clear that Edmund sees Miles as little more than an employee. The scene is laden with subtle tension as Edmund mocks Miles, making comments about how hard Miles must work to keep up with the estate's grandeur, belittling his role with sarcastic praise. Edmund takes particular joy in reminding Miles of his place in the social hierarchy. "You're lucky to be here, Miles," Edmund says, the words dripping with condescension. Miles, unfazed, continues his work without a hint of resentment. He knows his place, and for now, he is content with it. The camera lingers on Miles' face, capturing a flicker of something more than indifference, perhaps a quiet defiance or a deep sadness, but it's quickly masked. He shifts his weight and continues trimming, every motion deliberate, every movement controlled. Edmund's laughter echoes behind him as he enters the house, leaving Miles alone on the well-maintained lawn. This moment marks the beginning of the story. It presents a world divided by wealth, race, and power. Edmund, with his money and status, represents everything that the system values. Miles, seemingly trapped by the circumstances of his birth, stands in sharp contrast. Yet beneath their exterior facades, both men harbor secrets that will soon unravel. The next morning, as the sun rises, we are introduced to another aspect of Miles' life, a small, modest home on the outskirts of the estate. It's a far cry from the luxury of Edmund's mansion. The garden is wild, with flowers left untended and weeds growing between the cracks of the driveway. Miles arrives, exhausted but determined, to work on his personal projects. His eyes are sharp, his focus unwavering. His calm exterior belies a man who holds many unspoken stories. He doesn't just tend to the flowers in Edmund's estate. He has dreams of cultivating something greater, something that requires more than just sweat and labor. His mother, Doris, is in the kitchen, an elderly woman with a warmth in her voice, but a deep sadness in her eyes. She sits at the kitchen table, reviewing papers that appear to be official documents. Her hands tremble slightly as she holds one particular letter, which she folds and places in her purse as soon as Miles enters the room. Her reluctance to share the letter is clear, but the unspoken weight between them speaks volumes. The scene transitions to a conversation between Miles and Doris, revealing that Miles has been secretly investing in stocks, building a portfolio, and using the money he's made to fund a future for himself. He doesn't just work in Edmund's estate to survive. He's playing a far longer game. "One day, Miles, this will all pay off," Doris says, her voice soft but resolute. The conversation is tinged with hope, but it's also filled with a quiet desperation. Doris doesn't know exactly how much money her son has accumulated, and she doesn't understand all the stock jargon, but she trusts him. Miles, in contrast, is driven by a deeper ambition. His relationship with Edmund is an unspoken arrangement. He works for Edmund, but he is not bound by the limitations that the estate represents. He is preparing to step out of the shadows and claim something greater than mere survival. The next significant interaction between Miles and Edmund occurs when Edmund asks Miles to trim the front hedge again after a garden party at the mansion. The party is filled with the usual guests, wealthy individuals, socialites, and professionals who all admire Edmund's success. The contrast between the opulent guests inside and the hard-working gardener outside is striking. Miles stands by, cutting the hedge, listening to the laughter and the idle chatter of the guests. Edmund notices him standing there, leaning on the stone railing with a glass of whiskey in his hand. Edmund approaches, again laughing with that familiar air of superiority. "How's the garden, Miles?" he asks, his voice carrying a hint of mockery. "I bet you're proud to be part of such an incredible project, huh?" Edmund gestures toward the mansion, his face alight with pride, as though he's sharing his wealth with Miles as a favor. The statement, though layered with irony, feels oddly uncomfortable. For the first time, there's a hint of vulnerability in Edmund's voice. Miles, however, holds steady. He responds with a quiet nod, but instead of returning the mockery, he challenges Edmund with a phrase that leaves the air hanging between them. "It's a lot more than you think." The words are cryptic, almost out of place, but Edmund doesn't catch the full weight of them. The tension is subtle, but there's a shift. Something unspoken passes between them, a fleeting moment where Miles' calm exterior cracks, just slightly, revealing something deeper, something Edmund can't yet grasp. Later that night, Miles sits at the same kitchen table, his eyes staring out the window toward the distant mansion. His phone buzzes on the table. He picks it up to check his latest stock update. A message flashes on the screen. His portfolio has reached a new high, far surpassing any expectations. He smiles quietly to himself, but there's no sense of triumph in his expression, only the quiet satisfaction of a plan coming to fruition. Back in the mansion, Edmund hosts a private dinner for his wealthy friends, but his mind lingers elsewhere. His thoughts stray to the words Miles spoke earlier, but he dismisses them as nonsense. He laughs them off with his guests, but deep down, something about the interaction gnaws at him. As the night unfolds, Edmund's perception of Miles starts to subtly shift. The moment of casual dismissal, the quiet defiance, and the unexpected words linger in his thoughts, leaving him with an unsettling feeling he can't place. But that night, as he drifts off to sleep, his dreams are filled with images of a garden, a lush, green expanse, and in the middle of it, a single flower blooming far brighter than any others. The symbolism is clear. Something is growing beneath the surface, but Edmund has yet to see it. The seeds of deception have been planted. The two men, so seemingly disconnected by class and wealth, are on the precipice of a life-altering collision. Each holds pieces of the other's story, and soon, those pieces will fit together in ways neither could have anticipated. And so, the stage is set. What seems like a simple, yet divisive relationship between employer and gardener is poised to reveal much deeper currents, leading to an unraveling that neither can escape. The journey begins with a garden and a mockery, but it will end with a revelation that no one could have predicted. The question that lingers is simple. Who truly holds the power when the walls of illusion crumble? The next day arrives with the weight of unspoken tension hanging in the air. Miles continues his work at the estate, but the events of yesterday linger in his thoughts. The mocking laughter of Edmund echoes in his mind, but there's also a quiet determination in his every step now. He knows the cracks in Edmund's world are beginning to show, and perhaps it's only a matter of time before everything changes. As he walks through the pristine garden, cutting back the ivy, Miles surveys the estate's exterior as though for the first time. The flowers bloom in controlled patterns, the lawn manicured with an obsessive precision. Every inch of this space speaks of wealth, wealth that Miles doesn't envy, but that he does want to understand. He's already planted the seeds of his own financial empire in secret, but his connection to this world, the world of excess of status, feels like a distant dream, a dream he will one day claim as his own. Meanwhile, Edmund has become increasingly aware of the distance between himself and Miles, even though the gardener's demeanor remains unchanged. It's a small yet significant shift. Edmund's obsession with asserting his superiority has begun to morph into a quiet curiosity about Miles. There is no direct confrontation yet, but the undercurrent of tension between the two men has reached a tipping point. Edmund can no longer ignore the prickling feeling that something is happening, something beyond his control. The mansion itself seems to reflect Edmund's growing paranoia. His once perfectly ordered world is beginning to feel like it's slipping away, piece by piece. He stands in his office, staring out the window at Miles working on the hedges. He tries to focus on the task at hand, but his mind keeps wandering back to the enigmatic gardener. There's something about Miles' calm, steady composure that unsettles Edmund. It's as though Miles knows something Edmund doesn't, and that idea gnaws at him. Edmund dismisses the thought, but only half-heartedly. He's too invested in maintaining his image, his power, and his social standing to allow himself to be drawn into the mystery of Miles' life. But deep inside, there is a creeping suspicion that Miles is not what he seems. Edmund reaches for his drink, his fingers trembling ever so slightly, and takes a long sip, trying to rid himself of the unease that has lodged itself deep in his chest. Miles, on the other hand, is far more composed. As he works, he thinks of his mother, Doris. She had always been the one to remind him that hard work is important, but that it's not the only key to success. It's strategy, it's patience, it's knowing when to strike. And for the first time in his life, Miles feels that he's on the verge of something bigger than anything he's ever dreamed of. Miles finishes his work for the day and heads back to his modest home. His body aches from the hours spent trimming hedges and tending to the garden, but his mind remains sharp. Inside, Doris is waiting for him. The moment Miles steps through the door, she senses that something is different. There's a weight in the air, a change in his demeanor. "Miles," she says quietly, her voice trembling slightly, "you've been different lately. What's going on?" Miles pauses, his expression hardening momentarily. He knows his mother is perceptive, but he's also been guarding his plans closely. He can't share everything with her, not yet. He wants to protect her from the turmoil that's about to come. "Nothing, Ma," Miles says, brushing past her and dropping his bag on the kitchen table. He doesn't look at her immediately, but his gaze flits toward the window, where the mansion is just visible on the horizon like a looming shadow. It's just the usual. Work. Bills. You know how it is. Doris, however, isn't convinced. She walks over to him, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Miles, you're not telling me something. I know you're planning something. I can feel it." Miles sighs, finally turning to meet her gaze. His eyes soften as he sees the concern in her face. Doris had always been the one person who had given him hope, hope that he could rise above the constraints of his life, hope that he could build something that wasn't bound by the limitations others placed on him. "Ma, I'm close," he says quietly, his voice steady but full of determination. Everything is in motion. It's just a matter of time before things change. Doris watches him carefully, her face etched with a mixture of fear and pride. She doesn't fully understand what he means, but she knows this journey has taken its toll on him. "Be careful, Miles. There are risks and people who—" "I know, Ma. I'm doing this for us. You've sacrificed so much for me. It's time I do the same for you," he interrupts, his words tinged with both love and an underlying urgency. "Trust me." Doris nods, her expression softening. She doesn't push further, but the worry lingers in her eyes. She knows the road ahead won't be easy, and the path Miles is walking might take them both to places they can't predict. The scene shifts back to the mansion, where Edmund is growing increasingly restless. He has been unable to stop thinking about Miles. The gardener's words from their earlier interaction linger in his mind like an unresolved riddle. Edmund cannot fathom what Miles might know that could be of any real consequence. But what if Miles has figured out something Edmund hasn't? What if he has something on Edmund? Something that could bring him down? Edmund stares out the window, watching Miles working in the garden, seemingly oblivious to the storm brewing inside the mansion. The gardener's calm exterior drives Edmund mad. There's no way someone like Miles could be so composed, so unaffected by the gulf between them. In an uncharacteristic moment of frustration, Edmund picks up the phone and dials his lawyer. His conversation is clipped, urgent, and filled with a quiet anxiety that betrays his confidence. "I need to know everything about him," Edmund says, his voice low but intense. "Where does he come from? What does he really have? I want you to dig into his past. Everything." Back at this state, Miles finishes his work, his body weary, but his mind focused. He heads toward the gates of the mansion, stopping just short of the entrance as he catches sight of Edmund standing at the window of his office. Edmund is staring down at him, his eyes narrowed, watching him like a hawk. For a moment, the two men lock eyes across the distance. There's no direct communication, no words exchanged, but the silent challenge between them is palpable. Edmund's gaze holds a mix of curiosity, suspicion, and something darker, as if he's beginning to sense that Miles is more than he appears. Miles doesn't flinch. He simply turns away, walking toward the garden entrance as though nothing has changed. But everything has changed. The balance of power is shifting, and both men know it. What was once a clear division between employer and employee is now blurred, and the stakes are higher than ever. As the sun sets behind the mansion, the tension between them grows, like a storm brewing on the horizon. The seeds of deception are fully planted now, and it is only a matter of time before they bear fruit. Miles knows that the time is coming when he will have to confront Edmund, when the truth will finally come to light and everything will change. But as he walks away from the estate, his heart heavy with the weight of what's to come, there's a part of him that wonders. When the dust settles, will he be the one in control, or will it be Edmund, with his wealth and influence, who ultimately holds the power? The question lingers in the air, like the last rays of sunlight fading into dusk. The mansion, once a symbol of unshakable power, now feels like a fortress of secrets, a place where shadows loom not only in the corners, but also in the hearts of those who reside within its walls. Miles, ever watchful, knows that the mask Edmund wears is slipping. But with each passing day, the complexity of the situation deepens. The web of lies he's caught in grows more tangled. Every decision now carries weight, and as much as he's poised to strike, he's not certain how deep the game truly goes. Miles' steps grow more deliberate as he walks through the vast halls of the estate. His back is straight, his eyes alert, and his mind is a maze of thoughts, plotting and planning. His conversations with Doris have become fewer, but more intense, more filled with warning as she sensed the changes in his behavior. He continues to reassure her, though there's a storm inside him. He's close to something, a breakthrough, but it isn't clear whether it will bring him power or ruin. Edmund, on the other hand, is becoming increasingly paranoid, his hold on reality warping with every passing day. His world, once certain, is now filled with suspicion. When he's not distracted by work, his mind fixates on Miles. He can't quite place it, but something about the gardener unsettles him more each day. It's not that Miles is outwardly threatening, far from it, but the subtle way he moves, the way his eyes seem to pierce through the wealth and status Edmund has built, gnaws at him. It's as though Miles sees something in Edmund's life that Edmund himself hasn't fully acknowledged. One afternoon, as Miles trims the hedges near the garden's edge, Edmund watches from his office, unable to resist the growing urge to probe deeper into the gardener's past. The obsession is consuming him now. He's already instructed his lawyer to dig into Miles' background, to find out who he really is, where he came from, and what he might be hiding. The phone call from his lawyer earlier that morning had been unsettling. There were whispers, small revelations about the gardener's history, but nothing concrete, nothing that would give Edmund a true advantage. Then it hits him. A small slip-up during the phone call. His lawyer mentions something he hadn't expected. Miles isn't just a humble gardener. He's connected, not directly to Edmund, but to people far more influential than anyone on the estate. There's a name, a family, a network of wealthy individuals who have a vested interest in Miles' success. Edmund's mind races as he absorbs this new information. Miles has been playing him, playing the role of the humble servant while hiding his true identity. The realization is a jolt of cold shock that shakes Edmund to his core. The garden, so meticulously tended, becomes an image of Miles' duplicity, a reflection of the deception Edmund now knows is at the heart of the estate. The gardener had been planting his own roots beneath the surface, ones that neither Edmund nor anyone else could have imagined. Meanwhile, Miles is blissfully unaware of the storm brewing just beyond the horizon. His world is focused on one thing only, the upcoming auction. His chance to change everything is within reach. He's carefully cultivated this estate's gardens, studied the guests who come and go, and learned the details of Edmund's financial woes. Edmund's riches might seem endless, but cracks have appeared in the foundation of his empire. Miles senses it, and he's ready to leverage it. One evening, after a long day of work, Miles is called into Edmund's office. His presence is required. The words are curt, but Miles doesn't question them. Instead, he walks with purpose through the grand hallway toward the office, his heart a mixture of anticipation and calm resolve. It's time. Edmund, however, is not his usual arrogant self. There's something different in the air, a tension that Miles can feel but not quite name. He walks into the office, where Edmund is sitting behind his polished mahogany desk, staring at him with an intensity that seems to strip away all pretense of authority. "I need to know what you're up to," Edmund says without preamble. His voice is low, almost menacing. "I've had my lawyer look into your past." The words hit Miles like a slap, but his face betrays none of the shock he feels. Inside, however, a storm rages. His mind races, piecing together the dangerous path that has just been set before him. "You've been digging into me?" Miles asks, his voice steady, but a slight edge creeping into his tone. He doesn't move, doesn't flinch, but every muscle in his body is on high alert now. "I don't trust people like you," Edmund says, standing up and walking around the desk to stand in front of him. His voice is tinged with bitterness. "I don't trust anyone who doesn't know their place. You've been playing this role too well, Miles. Too well." Miles' heart beats faster, but his calm demeanor holds. "And what role is that, sir?" He asks the question with a patience that stings, as though the truth, the deeper layers of the situation, are becoming clearer to him by the second. "The gardener," Edmund spits out, as if the word itself is something to be ashamed of. "But you're not just a gardener, are you? You've been hiding something, and I'm going to find out what." The accusation is laced with venom, but what truly shakes Miles is the sudden realization of just how much Edmund fears him now. He is no longer just a servant to be ordered around. He's a threat, and Edmund's fear is palpable. "You don't know anything about me, Edmund," Miles says coolly, stepping forward with slow, deliberate movements. "You have no idea what I'm capable of." Edmund's face hardens, and for a moment, Miles sees the man he's been dealing with all this time, a man clinging to power, a man whose entire identity is built on his wealth and the people he controls. The anger in Edmund's eyes is unmistakable, but it's not directed at Miles alone. It's the fear of losing everything. "Get out," Edmund growls, his voice low and threatening. "I'll find out who you really are. Mark my words." Miles does not respond immediately. He simply turns and walks out of the room, his footsteps heavy, deliberate. Once outside, he allows himself a moment of relief, though it is fleeting. He knows that Edmund's paranoia will only grow, and now, more than ever, it's a matter of timing. Back at his modest home, the weight of the confrontation still presses down on him. Doris is waiting for him as always, but there's a wariness in her eyes tonight, a silent question in the way she watches him. She doesn't ask, but Miles knows she's feeling the strain of everything that's unfolding. "Miles," she says after a long silence, "you've done something, haven't you?" He nods slowly, sitting across from her. "I've set things in motion, Ma, but it's dangerous now. Edmund, he's caught onto me." Doris' expression tightens, her hand reaching out to touch his. "Be careful. This road, it's not the one I wanted for you." Miles meets her gaze, his eyes steely. "I have no choice. This is the only way." But even as he speaks the words, a part of him wonders if it's too late. Has he already gone too far? The truth of his plans is slipping through his fingers, just like the threads of his carefully spun web. And now, Edmund's betrayal, the unspoken acknowledgement that he knows more than he should, has set the stage for an irreversible descent. Miles and Edmund's paths are now locked in a dangerous spiral, each man trying to outwit the other, each playing their own game of deception. The stakes are higher than ever. And in the silence that follows their confrontation, one question lingers above all others. Who will be the last one standing? But as Miles contemplates the future, another twist is already unfolding, one that neither of them could have anticipated. The game is far from over, and it's about to take an even darker turn. The days that followed were a blur of tension and calculated moves. Miles could feel Edmund's eyes on him more often now, the oppressive weight of suspicion clouding every interaction. It wasn't just the occasional glance. It was a look that lingered, as though Edmund were trying to read every subtle change in Miles' demeanor, every flicker of his gaze, every nuance of his behavior. It was like being under constant surveillance. And Miles knew that this would be a game of endurance as much as it was one of intellect. Still, Miles pressed on. Every day, he worked with a new fervor in the garden, his movements precise, almost ritualistic. He knew that the public face of his labor was what kept him safe. As long as Edmund could see him as the docile servant, the quiet, unobtrusive gardener, there was a chance to slip beneath his radar. But Miles also knew that time was running out. Edmund's awareness of his growing power within the estate was too close now. There was no way to keep up the act for much longer. He could feel the ground shifting beneath him. The moment of truth arrived when Edmund, clearly agitated, summoned Miles once again. The summons was not unexpected, yet the urgency in Edmund's voice felt different this time. Miles had barely finished his work in the garden when he received the call. "I need you in my office now." Edmund's voice crackled through the intercom, the coldness in his tone unmistakable. Miles walked through the corridors of the mansion with a sense of foreboding. His heart beat a little faster than usual. His fingers, usually so steady, clenched into fists as he walked. This was it, the final confrontation. He didn't know whether Edmund had uncovered something crucial, or whether this was just another desperate attempt at intimidation, but it was clear the balance had tipped in a way that couldn't be undone. When Miles entered the office, Edmund stood at the window, staring out over the sprawling grounds. There was a storm outside, a tempest that matched the unease in the room. The wind howled as it crashed against the windows, rattling the glass. For a moment, Edmund didn't acknowledge him, standing there like a king on the edge of his kingdom, contemplating his next move. Finally, Edmund turned, his eyes narrow with suspicion, and beneath it, something more, something darker. "You've been hiding something from me, Miles," Edmund began, his voice tense, barely concealing his anger. "I don't know what it is, but I'm tired of pretending I don't see it." Miles didn't flinch. His gaze was steady, unwavering, though inside he could feel the familiar stirrings of fear and determination battling for control. He had prepared for this moment, but facing it was something else entirely. "I don't know what you mean, sir," Miles said, his voice calm, deliberately slow. "Oh, you'll play the humble gardener one more time, won't you?" Edmund sneered, walking around the desk toward him. His voice was laced with disdain, and the closer he came, the more Miles could feel the threat that hung in the air between them. "I don't know who you think you are, Miles, but I'll find out. I always find out." The words were like a challenge, a declaration of war. Edmund was no longer the indifferent master of the estate. This was a man whose world had started crumbling, and he was determined to crush anything or anyone who might accelerate that collapse. Miles had already set the wheels in motion, and now he felt the full weight of the consequences pressing against him. For a moment, the silence in the room was suffocating. Edmund paced, his boots clicking against the polished floor as he raged, building up his own internal storm. His eyes flicked toward the stack of papers on his desk, documents he'd likely obtained from his lawyer regarding Miles' past. He was searching for something, anything, that could give him leverage. "You're not just a gardener, are you?" Edmund's voice dropped to a cold whisper. "I've learned about you, about your family, your connections." Miles' pulse quickened, but he kept his face neutral. Edmund was right to suspect. Miles had carefully kept his true identity under wraps. He had come to the estate as a man of simple means, the quintessential servant, but there was a far more complex past hidden behind the man who now stood before Edmund. "What do you want from me?" Miles finally spoke, his voice measured but firm. "I'm just a man doing my job." Edmund let out a low laugh, filled with bitterness. "Do you think I'm stupid? Do you think you can hide behind that facade forever?" For the first time, Miles allowed himself to show a sliver of vulnerability. He clenched his fists, feeling the weight of everything he had built, everything he had come to the estate to destroy, teetering on the edge of collapse. There was a moment when he considered walking away, letting the charade crumble and embracing whatever consequences awaited him, but something inside him held firm. He could not retreat. "You don't understand, Edmund," Miles said, his voice gaining strength, the anger that had been quietly simmering now rising to the surface. "I've worked for everything I have. The connections you speak of aren't for you to use against me. They're a reminder that no one can control me, not even you." Edmund's face reddened with rage. His fists clenched at his sides. "You think you can walk in here, turn my world upside down, and threaten me without consequences?" Miles' lips curled into a faint smile, though it was cold, calculating. "I'm not threatening you, Edmund. I'm telling you the truth you've been trying to bury under your lies." Edmund stepped forward, his chest heaving, his voice a venomous whisper. "I won't let you get away with this. I'll ruin you." For a moment, it seemed as though the two men were locked in a battle of wills, but then Edmund's face shifted. The anger morphed into something else, something more cunning, more dangerous. "You think you know me, Miles? You think you have me figured out?" Miles held his ground, refusing to break the gaze. He knew that Edmund was a man who could destroy anyone who got in his way, but he also knew that Edmund had just underestimated him in a way that could cost him everything. The silence that followed was thick with tension, both men standing their ground, neither willing to back down. Finally, Edmund took a step back, his eyes narrowing as though he were weighing his next move. "I'll give you one last chance," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You tell me everything, who you are, what you want, and I'll let you leave this estate without any harm." But Miles was already far past the point of retreat. He knew that this offer was a trap. Edmund would never let him leave without ensuring his complete destruction. "No," Miles said firmly. "I've already made my choice." Without another word, he turned and walked toward the door, leaving Edmund seething in the wake of his defiance. As he stepped into the hallway, the weight of the decision settled into his bones. He had chosen his path, and there was no turning back now. Outside the mansion, the storm raged on, the winds howling as though in response to the turmoil that churned within the walls. Miles stood in the garden, breathing deeply, allowing the cool air to cleanse him. The storm was only just beginning, and the seeds of destruction had been sown. But what Edmund didn't know was that Miles had already planned for this moment. The web of lies they both wove was about to unravel, and when it did, neither man would be left standing unscathed. As Miles stood there, amidst the chaos of the storm, he knew that the real game had just begun, and there would be no winners, only those who would survive the wreckage. Miles could feel the ground shift beneath him as he made his way back to the garden, every step weighted with the knowledge that he was playing a dangerous game. He knew Edmund was not one to relent. The storm that had begun in the mansion was not just the weather outside. It was a war that had started between the two of them. Edmund would not forget the defiance that had just occurred, and Miles had no illusion that he would come out unscathed. The garden, a place of peace and solitude, had always been Miles' sanctuary, but now it felt like a battlefield. The shrubs, flowers, and winding paths seemed to mock him with their quiet beauty, so serene and still, a stark contrast to the turmoil swirling in his mind. The wind that had howled through the mansion now whispered through the trees, carrying with it a sense of foreboding. Miles needed to think, needed to plot his next move, but his mind was clouded by the weight of the encounter with Edmund. It was then that he noticed something. In the distance, barely visible through the heavy rain, stood a figure at the far edge of the estate. The silhouette was familiar, though the rain made it difficult to make out the features clearly. Miles squinted, his instincts immediately on alert. It was Evelyn, Edmund's wife. She stood still, staring at the mansion, her face hidden beneath the hood of her coat. The odd thing was, she wasn't moving. Miles had learned to read people's body language over the years, and something about Evelyn's stance made him uneasy. She wasn't there by accident. She had come to see him, and she wasn't waiting for him to approach. She was waiting for the right moment. He didn't know what to expect, but he did know that her involvement in this was not going to be a coincidence. He hesitated for a moment, considering his options. He could ignore her, retreat back into the sanctuary of the garden, or he could face whatever she had to say. The latter was the only option he could entertain. Evelyn had always been a quiet presence in the mansion, always playing the part of the dutiful wife, but there were times when Miles had caught glimpses of something deeper behind her calm exterior, something troubled, something desperate. Slowly, he made his way toward her. As he approached, the sound of the rain grew louder, deafening in its intensity. Evelyn didn't move as he drew nearer, her gaze still fixed on the mansion. When he stood beside her, only then did she turn her head, her eyes betraying a flicker of emotion that lasted only a second. There was fear in them, fear that hadn't been there before. "I know what you're planning," she said, her voice barely audible over the wind. Miles froze, his breath caught in his throat. He wasn't sure if he should feel relief or dread. Her words confirmed what he had suspected, that Edmund was far from the only person in the house who had been watching him. Evelyn had noticed him. She had figured him out. And somehow, that felt worse. "What do you mean?" Miles asked cautiously, trying to gauge her intentions. Evelyn glanced around, as though ensuring no one else was nearby. When she spoke again, her voice dropped to a whisper, almost as if she were confessing a secret. "I know you're not who you say you are. You're not just some lowly gardener." For a moment, Miles said nothing, his heart racing. So, she knew. It didn't surprise him, but it wasn't the revelation itself that unnerved him. It was the knowing look in her eyes, the quiet acceptance that somehow she was a part of this intricate game. Her face, usually so calm, now revealed the depth of her weariness, as if she had been carrying a secret too long and could no longer bear the weight of it. "Why are you telling me this?" Miles asked, his voice soft, betraying none of the unease he felt within. Evelyn sighed, stepping closer to him. The rain had soaked through her coat, but she didn't seem to mind. Her eyes were desperate, pleading in a way that he hadn't expected. "I'm not here to stop you," she said. "I'm here to warn you." Miles raised an eyebrow, unsure of where this was going. "Warn me? About what?" "Edmund," she whispered, her voice shaky. "He's dangerous. I don't know everything, but I know enough. He's been keeping things from you. He's not the man he presents himself to be. I'm not sure what he's planning, but whatever it is, it's not good." Miles felt a chill run down his spine. The tension that had been building inside him suddenly seemed to reach a breaking point. He'd suspected that Edmund's facade was only that, an act designed to keep his enemies at bay. But hearing it from Evelyn, someone who lived in the same house, someone who should have been in his corner, made the stakes suddenly so much higher. "Why are you telling me this now?" Miles asked, his voice quieter, yet more urgent. Evelyn hesitated, her gaze darting nervously to the mansion before she met his eyes again. "Because I can't live with myself if I don't. I'm afraid he'll destroy you if you keep pushing him. He's already gone too far. I'm scared for you, Miles." There was a rawness to her words, a sincerity that Miles hadn't anticipated. He had assumed she was just another part of the system, another pawn in Edmund's game, but now he could see the cracks in her armor. She wasn't just married to Edmund. She was trapped by him. Her warning wasn't just about Miles. It was a cry for help. "Why don't you just leave him?" Miles asked before he could stop himself, his frustration leaking into his voice. "Why stay?" Evelyn flinched, her face darkening with a mixture of regret and resignation. "You don't understand. I can't leave him. Not just because of me. There are things I've done, things we've both done, that tie us together. It's not as simple as walking away." The words hung in the air between them like a weight that neither of them could lift. Miles opened his mouth to ask her what she meant, but before he could speak, the sound of heavy footsteps approaching them interrupted the moment. Evelyn looked over her shoulder in alarm, her eyes widening with panic. "You need to go. Now. Edmund can't see us together." She was right. Edmund would have no mercy if he saw them speaking, especially not now. The web of lies was already tangled, and any misstep could lead to disaster. Without a word, Miles turned and walked away, leaving Evelyn standing in the rain, her face a mask of sorrow and fear. As he retreated to the safety of the garden, Miles' mind raced. Evelyn's warning weighed heavily on him. Edmund was a danger not just to him, but to everyone around him. There was more to this than a simple power struggle. Edmund was hiding something far darker than Miles had originally imagined. And now, Evelyn had unwittingly become part of his puzzle. Miles had always been a man of action, but he realized that the stakes had just risen exponentially. This was no longer just about his revenge. This was about survival, and possibly saving more than just himself. The rain began to fall harder, as though reflecting the chaos inside his mind. But one thing was certain. Miles couldn't back down now. The lies had been set in motion, and the truth was beginning to claw its way to the surface, piece by piece. He was on the edge of something far more dangerous than he had anticipated, and it was only a matter of time before everyone, would unravel. Miles had never felt a tension like this before. The air in the mansion was thick, oppressive, the weight of the moment pressing down on him like a tangible force. Every step he took toward the study where Edmund awaited felt like a step closer to a point of no return. The walls around him, so familiar and grand, now seemed like a trap. The towering portraits, the cold marble floors, and the elaborate tapestries, all reminders of the empire Edmund had built on lies. Miles had thought that he could outmaneuver Edmund with careful planning, but he was beginning to realize that it wasn't just about strategy anymore. It was personal. It was about power, about control, about identity. And in that moment, Miles understood that his life was no longer his own. Everything had been leading to this inevitable confrontation. The study door loomed ahead, as if daring him to enter. Miles paused, his hand on the brass handle, feeling the weight of the moment. He wasn't sure what he would find inside. Would Edmund be calm and collected, pretending as though nothing had changed? Or would this be the moment where the lies were finally shattered? The question echoed in his mind, but he didn't have the luxury of time. He had come this far. There was no turning back now. With a sharp inhale, he pushed open the door and stepped inside. Edmund sat behind his massive desk, the fire in the hearth casting long, flickering shadows across the room. The older man looked up slowly, his eyes cold and calculating. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was thick, each waiting for the other to make a move. Finally, Edmund broke the stillness, his voice low but deliberate. "I wondered when you'd show up. I should have known you'd be here, trying to play the hero." Miles' eyes narrowed, his pulse quickening. "I'm not here to play games anymore, Edmund. I'm done pretending I don't know what you've been hiding." Edmund's lips curled into a thin, humorless smile. "Hiding? You think I've been hiding something from you? You've always been a smart man, Miles, but you've never quite understood the full picture. I didn't hide anything. I simply didn't offer you the truth because it was never meant for you." Miles felt his chest tighten. "You've been playing me this whole time. Every move you've made, Every word you've said, it was all part of your plan. But I see through it now. I know who you really are, and I know what you've done." Edmund leaned forward, his hands steepled in front of him. His eyes darkened, no longer hiding the malicious glint beneath his calm exterior. "You think you understand? You think you've figured all out? You're just a fool, Miles. All these years, you've been nothing more than a pawn. And now you think you can break free? It's too late. You've already lost." For a brief moment, everything inside Miles froze. The room felt suffocating, and the weight of Edmund's words settled into his bones like cold steel. He had come here to confront the man who had controlled him, to challenge the power that had held him captive. But now, with the truth hanging in the air like an iron fist, he wondered if it had all been in vain. Could he really break free? Or was he destined to remain trapped, forever at the mercy of Edmund's will? But Miles couldn't afford to doubt. Not now. Not when everything was on the line. "I haven't lost, Edmund," Miles said, his voice steady but laced with a cold fury. "You might think you've won, but you're wrong. This isn't about power or control anymore. It's about who we are, and I'm not going to let you destroy everything just to protect your lies." Edmund's eyes flashed with anger, but before he could retort, a sharp voice interrupted the tense silence. "Enough!" Evelyn appeared at the doorway, her face pale but resolute. Miles turned to look at her, surprised by her sudden arrival. She stepped into the room, her posture rigid, as though she had been carrying the weight of something she could no longer keep hidden. "Evelyn." Edmund's voice was a mixture of disbelief and fury. "What are you doing here?" Evelyn didn't flinch. She walked toward the desk, her eyes never leaving her husband. "I'm here to stop this. I'm done being part of your charade, Edmund. I'm done pretending that everything's okay when I know the truth that you've been hiding for years." Edmund stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor as he faced her. The room seemed to crackle with tension, each word exchanged between them fueling the fire that had long been simmering beneath the surface. "You know nothing," Edmund snarled. "You think you can just waltz in here and destroy everything I've built? You're as weak as he is." Evelyn's eyes narrowed, her voice cold but steady. "I know enough to know that this isn't who you were supposed to be. I know that you've manipulated everything, twisted every truth to make yourself into something you're not. But I'm done. I'm done being afraid of you. I'm done." Miles watched the exchange with a growing sense of clarity. Evelyn, for all her quiet composure, had been biding her time. She had been a prisoner in this house, just like him, trapped by the man who had built his empire on lies. And now, she was breaking free. It wasn't just about Miles anymore. It was about them both, finding a way to survive in the wreckage of a life built on deceit. Edmund's face twisted in rage, his fists clenched at his sides. "You're both fools. You have no idea what you're getting into. I've already won. This is just a temporary setback." But Miles was no longer intimidated. The truth was out now, and no matter what Edmund said, it didn't change the fact that the walls were closing in on him. The web of lies he had spun was unraveling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. "You haven't won, Edmund," Miles said quietly, stepping forward. "You never did. You were always afraid that someone would see through your mask. But now it's all coming apart." Edmund's eyes flickered with a mix of fear and fury, but there was no escape for him now. The truth was out, and no amount of anger could change that. For a long moment, none of them spoke. The silence between them was suffocating, the weight of everything that had been said hanging in the air. And in that silence, the truth settled, undeniable and final. Miles looked at Evelyn, his heart heavy with the realization that everything had come to this point. The lies, the manipulation, the power struggles, it was all coming to an end. Edmund was no longer in control. The house, the empire he had built, was crumbling before them. "What happens now?" Miles asked, his voice low, but steady. Evelyn met his gaze, her eyes filled with uncertainty and something more. "Hope, perhaps. We start over. We rebuild. But this time, It'll be different. No more lies. No more hiding. And for the first time, Miles allowed himself to believe that it was possible. The storm outside raged on, but in that moment, a new clarity filled him. The battle wasn't over, but they had won the first fight. In the silence that followed, as the fire crackled in the hearth and the storm howled outside, the weight of their words settled into the room. The journey they had begun was far from finished, but the lies, the deceptions that had held them all captive, were finally shattered. And in the quiet aftermath, the only thing that remained was the truth. As the tension in the room hung like a heavy fog, Miles could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins. The silence was suffocating, as if every breath they took was a betrayal of the air around them. He looked at Evelyn, her gaze unwavering, and for the first time, they shared a fleeting moment of understanding. This wasn't just about revenge or confrontation anymore. It was about redemption, about taking back everything they had lost, about finding the pieces of themselves that had been buried under the weight of lies. Edmund's voice broke the stillness again, cutting through the air like a blade. You think you can break me, don't you? You think exposing the truth will make everything better? You're wrong. It's too late for that now. His tone had shifted, no longer the calm, manipulative one that had once held so much power over them. Now it was a desperate, almost pleading cry. A man who had realized too late that the fortress he had built around himself was crumbling. You have no idea what you're dealing with. But Miles wasn't afraid anymore. Not of Edmund's words, not of his power, not of the threat that hung in the air like a guillotine waiting to fall. Edmund had spent his life controlling people, manipulating them with half-truths and promises, but now he was exposed. The very foundation of his world had been torn apart, and there was no coming back from it. No, Edmund, Miles said, his voice steady, though the fire in his chest still smoldered. I know exactly what I'm dealing with. You built your empire on lies, on the manipulation of everyone around you. But lies have a way of falling apart, don't they? Edmund's eyes narrowed, and for a brief moment, Miles saw a flicker of fear pass through them, an emotion Edmund had never allowed himself to show before. You think you've won, but you haven't. You'll regret this. For a long while, no one spoke. The storm outside had begun to die down, but the atmosphere in the room felt like an electric charge, a storm of its own brewing between the three of them. Miles was acutely aware of the weight of every word, every glance, every movement. This wasn't just a confrontation. This was a reckoning. Evelyn broke the silence, her voice quieter now, but no less fierce. I've spent years walking on eggshells, pretending I didn't know what you were doing, Edmund. But not anymore. I'm done with this. I'm done with you. And if you think you're going to intimidate me, you're wrong. Miles watched as her defiance echoed through the room. She had always been strong, even when she tried to hide it. But now, in this moment, she had fully stepped into her own power. She wasn't just Miles' ally. She wasn't just the victim of Edmund's manipulations. She was a force in her own right. For the first time, Edmund seemed to falter. His hands trembled slightly, and for a moment, his gaze wavered. He was used to being in control, used to being the one who dictated the terms of every conversation, every outcome. But now, the reality was sinking in. He had no control over this moment. He had no power left. And then, Miles saw it. The truth that Edmund had been hiding for so long. The real reason behind everything. His twisted need for domination. You never cared about the money, did you? Miles said, the realization dawning on him as the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. It was never about the wealth, the mansion, or the power. It was about control. You were never going to be satisfied until you had everything. Until you were the one holding the reins of everyone's life. You wanted to be untouchable. Edmund's face went pale, his lips trembling. There it was, the secret he had been guarding for so long, the truth he had buried so deep. You don't understand, Edmund whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of his own desperation. I had no choice. This was the only way. I had to control everything, everyone. I had to become something more than human, something more than ordinary. I didn't want to be weak. I couldn't stand the idea of being insignificant. I wanted more. Miles felt a pang of something unfamiliar. Was it sympathy? He had always seen Edmund as the villain, the man whose actions were calculated, cold, and ruthless. But now, with the layers stripped away, he saw the man behind the facade, a man who had been broken long before Miles had ever crossed his path. "It doesn't have to be like this, Edmund," Miles said quietly. "You don't have to keep lying. Keep running from your past. You've hurt so many people, but there's still time to make it right. You don't have to lose everything." Edmund looked at him, a flicker of something almost human passing through his eyes. It was almost as though he wanted to believe Miles, wanted to reach out and find redemption. But in the end, his pride, his need for control, was stronger. His shoulders sagged, and he closed his eyes briefly as if to gather what little strength he had left. "You don't understand. I can't stop now. I can't let everything go. I've built too much. It's too late." Miles felt the finality in Edmund's words, and it struck him like a dagger to the heart. Some people, no matter how much they're offered, no matter how many chances they're given, are too far gone. Some people are so entrenched in their own lies that they can never escape the prison they've created for themselves. And no matter how much Miles tried to reach him, no matter how much he wished Edmund would see reason, it was clear now. There was no saving him. Evelyn's voice cut through the quiet despair that had settled over them all. "Let him go, Miles. It's over. We can't change him. We can only change ourselves." Miles nodded, the weight of those words sinking deep into his soul. She was right. Edmund had made his choice. And now, it was time for them to move on, to rebuild, to leave the ashes of the past behind and move toward the future they had both dreamed of. It would be a long road, one filled with uncertainty, but they had already taken the first step. They had already faced their demons. "You're right," Miles said softly. He turned away from Edmund, his gaze lingering for a moment, then finally leaving the man to his fate. Edmund didn't resist. He didn't beg. He didn't try to fight anymore. He simply watched as they left, his once mighty empire crumbling around him. As the door to the study closed behind them, Miles and Evelyn stood in the hallway for a long while, the silence between them no longer heavy but comforting. It wasn't a silence born of fear or uncertainty, but of understanding, of two people who had been through hell and come out the other side, bruised but stronger. And in that moment, Miles knew, truly knew, that it wasn't the lies that defined them. It was their choices, their ability to rise above the darkness and find their way back to the light. The journey ahead would be long, and they didn't have all the answers. But they had each other, and for the first time in a long while, that was enough.